Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We will get started shortly as we wait for folks to join the live call. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We will officially get started in a few minutes. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Mendieta. I am the Policy Associate at National Council of Nonprofits, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Legal Landscape and Path Ahead for Nonprofits and Philanthropy. Thank you for joining us. We have a lot of interest in this call. More than 6,000 people registered to receive the recording and more than 5,000 registered to join us live. So thank you for joining. Just some brief items before we officially get started. This call is being recorded and everyone is in listen only mode. We do have live captioning and ASL interpretation available. And I do want to emphasize that we received a lot of questions given the amount of people who registered. So we have over 1,000 people who submitted a question. And so we will try to cover as many of them as possible or make sure that you will have access to the information that you need. And a recording of this webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel, and all registrants will receive an email from us tomorrow with the link. With that said, I will now turn it over to our CEO for some opening remarks. Hi, Diane. Good to see you.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you. And hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Diane Yentel. I'm President and CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits, and I'm so glad that so many of you have joined us today for this important webinar. As you all know very well, since the start of the Trump administration, we've seen a relentless and unprecedented attack on nonprofits and on the people and communities that we serve, with wildly inaccurate statements and reckless actions intended to harm our reputation, our value, and our fundamental purpose, which is to serve and advocate for people in need without the aim of profit. There's no mistaking that this administration's actions and rhetoric are targeting nonprofit organizations and the people and communities that we serve through dozens of executive orders that the president has signed that would have a harmful impact on the nonprofit sector and the people and communities we serve, through associated actions that the president and his administration are taking, some sweeping, radical, and reckless, like the OMB directive issued 1 week after inauguration to attempt to shut down virtually all federal spending, and through clear repressive tactics with a purposeful chilling effect on nonprofits that are doing good work, and especially those that are working with some of the most marginalized and vulnerable to harm people. The truth is, this administration is implementing a broad assault on civil society and on democracy. And I'm often asked these days, of all the threats to the nonprofit sector, which concerns me the most? And my answer is silence. In this moment, with the onslaught of threats against civil society, what concerns me most is the silence of too many leaders and too many organizations. But not here on this webinar, and not today. Today, we've brought together leaders who are being anything but silent, leaders who are speaking out in the courts and in their fields about a need and with a way to recognize that this moment is unique and uniquely threatening, and it requires all of us to act, speak out, and respond in ways that may be new and that are bold and powerful. Our speakers on today's webinar will discuss the current legal landscape, how foundations are and must respond, and to share a call to action, ways that you all can get involved in meeting this moment and in defeating the threats to the nonprofit sector together. So first, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Skye Perryman. Skye is president and CEO of Democracy Forward, an organization that uses the law to build collective power and advance a bold, vibrant democracy for all the people. Democracy Forward is representing the National Council of Nonprofits in our 2 lawsuits against the administration, and they're representing clients in probably a couple dozen additional lawsuits at this point against the administration. And as we have all seen in these last few weeks, the courts are providing essential checks against this administration's lawless actions. And it's in large part because of the Democracy Forward team under Skye's leadership that they are. Skye is an absolute powerhouse, and she's extremely busy these days. They're in court, it seems, nearly every day, and again this afternoon. And so I'm so appreciative of her for her time in joining us today, and even more so for her leadership and her partnership. Skye, welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me, Diane, and to everyone that's joining. We know that regardless of what community you serve, what issues you work on, that you are working on the front lines of serving people and communities across this nation at a time when the stakes could not be higher. We so appreciate the partnership with the National Council of Nonprofits, and it's a partnership that's really born out of necessity and commitment. I'll give a few remarks about what we're seeing in the legal landscape, how National Council of Nonprofits under Diane's tremendous leadership is responding in this moment, what we hope we see across the civil society community in our country in the days ahead, and what we are expecting. We are in an unprecedented moment, and the American people have many diverse views and viewpoints on lots of issues of policy. But what we are seeing right now in this country is an all-out assault on things that we all have in common: a need for fair laws, a need for process, a need to be heard, and a need to be able to continue on a path where the real question is about how we keep people and communities thriving, how we help them thrive more, not about whether we're taking away people's constitutional rights or engaging in retribution and targeting of civil society organizations or communities. But yet that is where we are. As a result of the Trump-Vance administration's announcement and then tactics where they were going to pursue a shock and awe approach, we have seen communities across the country suffer. In the first days of this administration in January, in the middle of a day, I'm sure all of you remember it, there was an announcement that the administration by the next day at 5 p.m. would freeze federal funding to all federal funding across the country. And what that freeze is it's not really a federal funding freeze. It is an essential services freeze. It is telling groups like the ones that you work on the front lines with every day that they may not be able to serve their communities. Groups that are serving elder populations, young people, families across the country were threatened as a result of this. In the middle of the night, the leader of the National Council of Nonprofits, Diane, conferred with the organization and other leadership and decided that National Council of Nonprofits would step in and would step in with public health leaders and small business leaders and others and get into court the next morning to seek to stop this really problematic and harmful freeze. We were honored to be able to represent the National Council of Nonprofits in court. We're still in that case, and we're able to block the freeze on federal funding before it was implemented. We, of course, know that there are a range of organizations and communities that are not getting the funding that they are entitled to under our laws because the administration continues to engage in a pattern of weaponizing federal funding against people and communities. But we have been able, through this court action that has continued and that has continued to be successful, to stop the broad nationwide freeze. That is a direct result of Diane and National Council of Nonprofits stepping up, stepping forward, not being intimidated, and understanding that in this moment, it is about what we can all do with our organizations, with our communities, with our lives, and with our platforms to protect the American people. We are continuing to work with the National Council of Nonprofits on a range of legal strategies and planning as we look about what's ahead. So I'll take a real step back for a moment and talk about what we have seen in the last 55 days or so. The shock and awe approach the Trump administration came in with was one that the legal community did seek to understand and plan for as much as possible. We launched a group of organizations called Democracy 2025. You can go to that website online, democracy2025.org, where we are tracking all of the executive actions that are coming out of the White House and the responses, which in many cases are litigation responses, organizations like ours and others across civil society representing clients in court, state attorneys general, in many cases stepping in, and there was a state AG case on the funding freeze case. And as a result of that work, there have been more than 100 lawsuits that have been filed to challenge over 50 administrative actions just in the last 50 days or so. And those are lawsuits that are happening out of necessity. No one wants to have to prepare legal action quickly and overnight if you don't have to. But what we are seeing is on a near constant basis, the reversals of core rights and protections for people, and an attempt to weaponize the very parts of government that are seeking to serve us all, our federal funding streams, the data and evidence that the data and information that the government collects, the federal programs that the government institutes. We're really seeing an all-out assault on the ability of our government to work for people, not to mention core due process and constitutional rights. So that's required the litigation, and you're seeing a lot of it. The question is, how is the administration responding to that? And I will tell you that the litigation is really successful in court. The Trump administration has lost a lot more than they have prevailed. And I'm not aware, except for a few instances where federal judges have said when they've actually considered what the administration is doing at this point, that they have said that it is okay and lawful. In many instances, judges are having to stop, to slow it down, to investigate, and in several, in a range of instances, they're just saying outright, this is an unconstitutional or unlawful action. So the litigation is working with respect to being in court. It's also working with respect to galvanizing communities where people can really use a tool they have, which is the ability to use the legal process to advocate for their rights. But we're also seeing an administration that does not want to be constrained by the law. And so later today, I will be in court because of deep concerns that we have about how the administration is complying with certain court orders in another case. And many lawyers across the country are in these fights as well. And so I will tell you that in many instances, the courts are being quite loud and quite clear that this is a country of laws and that the government has to comply. And when they are clear and loud, we have seen the government at least seek to come into compliance when they are pushed. We don't know if that has changed over this past few days where the administration has really amped up its disregard for court orders, but we are going to continue to work in court and across the country to ensure that the law is respected and that this legal tool is something that can be utilized. So as we look across what to expect, we do think for nonprofits, you will see continued scrutiny from the federal government, most of which we believe is unconstitutional, but nevertheless, they will seek to use continued scrutiny on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging programs. I know my friend and colleague Damon is going to speak to you all about that, so I'm not going to say as much on that. We know that they will seek to continue to dismantle federal agencies that hold many of the programs that you all implement. Most of those, the vast majority, if not all of those attempts are unlawful, and you will see those swiftly challenged in the courts, but it is a place to look. And then we also know that they will continue to seek to weaponize federal funding and the federal funding process. And so we're working with the National Council of Nonprofits to understand how to best respond to that legally as we continue to move forward. Another thing I want to flag is this continued rhetoric around retribution and retaliation. This is a tool that the administration is using in order to prevent people from doing essential work and in order to convince people and communities across this country that there is nothing that individuals can do to build a better future, to turn the tide, or to protect themselves. This is a difficult time, we know, for so many of you that are tuning in. It is a difficult time for all of us. They are targeting the lawyers as well. But what we know about this country is that when people stand firm and stand together in solidarity with a commitment to build a better future, there is nothing that can stop that, especially when you're armed with the rule of law and with the tools that our democracy provides to demand better for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, and for our country. So I'm here to really say thank you for tuning in, but to also to invite you to examine what you can do with your own lives, what you can do in your own communities and with your own organizations to be a beacon of light in this time. Courage is a practice. It's not something that any of us are just born with. It is something that you practice every single day by doing hard things, but it's also contagious. And it's something that once we all start having courage, we can be so much more powerful than we are individually. And so we are really at Democracy Forward here to support any organization that wants to be on the road to protecting our democracy, to protecting people and communities across this country, and to finding courage and community. And we could not be more honored to be partnering with the National Council of Nonprofits and so many of your other organizations that are, even against great odds, taking stands so that we can build a better future together. So I just want to thank Diane so much for having me here, and thank all of you for tuning in.
Thanks so much, Skye. Fantastic remarks. Really appreciate you. Good luck in court today.
Thank
Go get
you.
them. We appreciate you so much. Thank you. So now, before we hear from our next speaker, I want to give a few additional updates on the lawsuits, the 2 lawsuits that the National Council of Nonprofits has filed. And in both of those cases, we are represented by Democracy Forward. So last month, as part of its attack on federal funding and the nonprofit sector, the White House attempted to shut down all federal funding overnight. Really, a truly reckless move that would have had catastrophic consequences for the communities and people that nonprofit organizations serve. So the National Council of Nonprofits and our co-plaintiffs joined with Democracy Forward and sued OMB to stop this reckless action from being put into effect. And we succeeded, as Skye just shared. There's currently a court-ordered national preliminary injunction in place that prohibits the administration from moving forward with such a sweeping freeze of all federal funding. And that preliminary injunction has had a real positive effect for nonprofits and our work. All of the NCN members who filed declarations to the court of their funding freezes related to the OMB directive have had that funding turned back on. We've heard from many of you, many of our partners throughout the country, that arbitrary across the board shutdown of funding for their programs has ended. And it's essential that we keep it that way, that we continue moving our case forward in the court to ensure that OMB can never again implement such a sweeping, reckless freeze on all federal funding. So our next hearing in this case, which is NCN et al. V. OMB, is set for mid-April in the U.S. District Court of DC, and certainly we'll keep you posted on that. But still, even with this success, the administration is finding other ways to dismantle essential funding. So last week, NCN filed a second lawsuit, this time with co-plaintiffs that are NCN members in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Virginia. And this case, which is the Woonasquatucket River Watershed Council, the Department of Agriculture. In this case, we're suing federal agencies that are unlawfully withholding funds for nonprofit organizations to do essential work that was authorized by the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The administration in this case is arbitrarily freezing these congressionally appropriated funds that are halting programs to, for example, reduce lead in school and daycare water fountains, programs to weatherize the homes of low-income Americans, to lower their utility bills, to maintain green spaces in disadvantaged areas, and to reduce the risk of wildfires throughout land management. So this kind of lawless freezing of funds really is harming many and benefiting none. So our new NCN lawsuit is against multiple federal agencies that are responsible for withholding these funds, including OMB, USDA, the Department of Energy, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, EPA, and the Department of the Interior. And in that case too, we'll be sure to keep you posted on progress in the coming days and weeks. So just as NCN's current litigation protects against broad federal funding freezes, many of our partners are suing the administration to halt attempts to roll back progress in many ways, especially related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm very glad to have on the webinar with us today one such leader that is working through the courts to stop such efforts. Damon Hewitt is the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Damon has more than 20 years of civil rights litigation and policy experience, including prior leadership roles in the nonprofit, philanthropic, and public sectors. I've known Damon for 20 years, since he was with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, working on recovery and rebuilding in the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina. So I'm delighted to welcome Damon to this call today to talk about the important lawsuit that he and his colleagues have filed against the administration's efforts to dismantle DEI throughout the country. Damon, thank you for joining. I'll turn it to you.
Thanks so much, Diane, and thank you for your and your organization's leadership and your litigation and your courage, as Skye referred to. It takes those types of efforts as tip of the spear and our aligned efforts to actually make a difference. I wanted to offer first a brief bit of context. You know, I think one of the prior speakers, maybe Skye, spoke about weaponization. There are really two things happening at once, especially when it comes to civil rights infrastructure at the federal level. There's a simultaneous weakening of the infrastructure, frankly, such that people don't have anywhere to turn. The dismantling, essentially, of the EEOC, the freezing of the Civil Rights Division at DOJ, among others, the metastasization of the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. And that is a prelude, that weakening is a prelude to the weaponization with the Department of Education issuing a Dear Colleague letter to every one of the 14,000 local education agencies and every higher ed institution, saying that if you don't follow our interpretation of civil rights law, then you will lose federal funding. Interpretations that frankly have no or little basis in law or in fact. So this weaponization was really most pronounced, frankly, on the first 2 days of the administration, when Trump issued 2 executive orders challenging and attacking, frankly, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs with an incredibly broad brush. I want to talk about one of those in particular that's been subject to litigation. It's called the Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferences. Now, the kind of language you see in this executive order makes it look as if they're after the worst racist boogeyman that you've ever heard of. Claims of immense public waste and shameful discrimination, labeling DEI programs as essentially presumptively illegal, and calling for the termination of all diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility mandates, policies, programs, quote unquote preferences, not only in the federal government, but then also calling for the termination, to the extent allowed by law, to all DEI, DEIA, and environmental justice offices, positions, contracts, and grants. And that last piece is where there's been substantial litigation. There have been at least 4, maybe 5 lawsuits filed to this point, and I'll talk about one of them, but the first in time was filed by Democracy Forward, Skye, Perryman, and AAJC, Asian Americans Advancing Justice. That's been a tip of the spear suit that did secure for a time a nationwide preliminary injunction that's now been called into question, and we'll talk about that. Another lawsuit was filed by our friends at LDF and Lambda Legal. A third lawsuit filed by Lambda Legal alone, and then a lawsuit that we filed at the Lawyers Committee. What's important about these lawsuits is that while there are overlapping claims in common, we're presenting different types of situations in terms of plaintiffs and impacted communities. For example, the LDF Lambda Legal lawsuit represents, among others, the National Urban League. There's an AIDS foundation that's represented by Lambda Legal in their solo case. At the Lawyers Committee, we represent an organization called Chicago Women in Trades, an organization whose membership and clientele is 70% Black and Latina women, women who otherwise would be locked out of the trades like carpentry, plumbing, construction, the kind of trades where people don't automatically think women belong, but they're here to say women do belong. But there's frankly an equity issue in the fact that women are excluded. So when you take these types of organizations and those types of missions and say that if you have an equity-related grant, it will be terminated, that not only goes to a challenge to the particular grant, but really a challenge to the entire mission and the viewpoint of the organization overall, the work that it's trying to accomplish, the good it's trying to bring into the world. And so that's the reason why what you see in many of these cases, including our case at the Lawyers Committee on behalf of Chicago Women in Trades, are First Amendment claims. We believe that these executive orders violate the First Amendment because they are vague and overbroad, because we believe they constitute viewpoint discrimination. We also believe they violate rights to due process. But also, really importantly, something that people aren't talking about enough, I think, is that we've also alleged that this is a violation of separation of powers. Because if Congress has appropriated funds, who is the executive branch to decide we don't want to spend those funds? We don't want to use those funds. And in fact, that we're actually going to impose new requirements not required by federal law on how funds actually get used. That is simply not permissible. That is a usurpation of Congress's own authority. And as we've told many friends on the Hill, they should be hopping mad about this as well. We want to see them get active, if not in litigation directly, at least as amici, as friends of the court. I also want to note that in the LDF and Lambda Legal case, they also filed an equal protection claim. They have a hearing on their motion for preliminary injunction coming up on Wednesday, I believe, in the DC District Court. So really looking forward to what they can get there. Now, let me take a step back and talk about, I mentioned the nationwide preliminary injunction that Democracy Forward and AAJC obtained. The Fourth Circuit issued a stay on that nationwide preliminary injunction. The rationale is really troubling, and I'll tell you why. In a nutshell, even though the court didn't rule on the merits of, and certainly did not suggest that these executive orders do not violate First Amendment, Fifth Amendment, and other constitutional principles, the decision really went to the breadth of the injunction, suggesting that it perhaps is not proper, that there are non-parties to the case that are bound by the nationwide preliminary injunction. But also the other really troubling piece was this notion that this was essentially a request for pre-enforcement relief. Now, of course, what we try to do is not just react to bad things, but also stop bad things before they happen. And so if this ruling stands and if other courts don't step up with their own injunctions that are held up on appeal, we could be in a scenario where we're told essentially you must wait for the bad thing to happen. And so think about the context here. It's not just the actual enforcement, it's the chilling effect of Trump's Jedi mind trick of telling people that all the things you've been doing for decades simply to comply with your federal civil rights obligations, those are now somehow presumptively illegal, perhaps even unconstitutional. And the chilling effect has led to this preemptive compliance. We're seeing higher ed institutions fall. We are seeing philanthropies be in a serious tizzy and very concerned and asking difficult, sometimes honest, but sometimes just puzzling questions of grantees that are causing them to reevaluate their entire missions and how they do business. We're also seeing some of this preemptive compliance from law firms. We are working behind the scenes to make sure that law firms stand up and stand together, because we now know that law firms are being attacked directly as well. And so if we cannot push through here and break through and actually receive and uphold decisions with respect to pre-enforcement relief, then we're going to be in a world of potential hurt. Remember, in these executive orders, federal agencies have up until essentially the end of this month or later this week, in fact, to take their action. So we could start seeing specific enforcement soon. But I think what's much more likely with this type of administration is that we have less mass specific enforcement, but more sort of Damocles hanging over people's heads. That has a chilling effect that is paralyzing to nonprofits, especially those in civil rights and racial justice. So what I love, though, about these cases is that you see a degree of alignment that I don't think we've seen in a long time in our civil rights legal work. You're seeing different types of plaintiffs and communities impacted, but you're also seeing common claims. You're also seeing these filed strategically in different courts. The Northern District of California, we filed the Northern District of Illinois, the District of DC, and also District of Maryland. And so we are going to create a blanket that is going to cover as many federal agencies as possible, because there's multiple federal agencies being sued, and get good precedent in different courts. And we believe ultimately we will prevail, and we'll do that together. Thanks so much. Happy to answer questions later.
Great. Thank you very much, Damon, for your remarks and even more for your leadership and your work. So as nonprofit organizations throughout the country are struggling with this onslaught of attacks against the sector and our important work, many have been asking and wondering, how will foundations respond? And while some have yet to share their plans, some have been clear in words and actions that they see a need to step up even more to shore up the important work of the sector for this moment. And I'm very glad to have leaders from two such foundations with us today. So first, we'll hear from Jean Ries. Jean is a civil society and leadership program officer at the David and Lucile Packard Foundation, where she oversees the foundation's work to strengthen leaders, organizations, and movements to promote thriving civic spaces. With more than 20 years of experience in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector, Jean is experienced at cultivating trusted partnerships to scale impact, and she's also committed to investing in people's well-being to foster a thriving civil society. So thank you, Jean, both for your steadfast support for NCN and our partners throughout the country, and for being here today. I'll turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you for being such a leader in this work and in this space. Really appreciate it. So as Diane said, my name is Jean Ries. I'm a program officer in the Civil Society and Leadership Initiative at the Packard Foundation. And over the next about 6 minutes, I'm going to highlight who we are and why a strong civil society matters, how Packard and other funders are stepping up to meet today's challenges, and what funders and nonprofits can do now and in the future to safeguard civil society. The top headline is that the urgency is real and the threats are growing. My hope and belief is that together we do have the power to make a difference. So who we are. The Packard Foundation is a family foundation committed to supporting leaders and organizations that invest in children and families, protect the ocean and climate, and advance just and inclusive societies. We believe that a thriving civil society is at the heart of this work. More specifically, the Civil Society and Leadership Initiative is focused on strengthening the sector. We believe that civil society includes nonprofits, grassroots organizations, and movements driving change in areas like climate action and reproductive health. The problem that we see is that across the US and globally, civil society faces increasing threats, from legal restrictions to harassment and intimidation. Without the ability to organize, speak out, and advocate, progress is stalled. Our goal is to ensure that organizations and leaders have the resources, capacity, and protections they need to navigate these challenges. So some more about how funders, including Packard, are and can respond in this moment. In this moment of uncertainty, philanthropy must truly adapt. In many ways, it is similar to what we did during the COVID epidemic. So specifically, the Packard Foundation is responding by providing flexibility, for example, early grant payments, no-cost extensions on current grants, and more general operating support. We are investing in resilience, which I'll talk about some more, supporting capacity building, leadership, security, and crisis response. And we're collaborating for impact. We're learning from global models to build stronger protections for US civil society. Some specific solutions in action that we are doubling down on. The first is the Resilience Initiative. This is a program that we launched after the 2016 election to help organizations build adaptive capacity. The Resilience Initiative offers accessible, tailored support for nonprofits facing policy, operational, leadership, and programmatic shifts. An example of the type of services that this program provides would be 5 hours of leadership coaching for a new executive director taking over for a founder ED, or well-being supports for the staff of a small grassroots organization, and ongoing webinars addressing timely topics such as fundraising, financial management, and human resources. A newer offering that we launched in October of 2024 is Nonprofit Secure. This is a platform to address US nonprofit safety and security concerns. It covers digital, physical, psychological, crisis communications, and legal securities. An example of some of the ways that grantees have been accessing Nonprofit Secure is an organization where the leader had information doxed and needed urgent digital security support, or an organization needing immediate legal review of their statements on DEIJ work as a reaction to anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion executive orders. These programs are currently offered and available to Packard grantees. But there are more actions that we have the ability to take now. For funders, you have the opportunity to share with your grantees existing free resources. For example, Access Now provides digital and cybersecurity support through a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour hotline. And the Democracy Security Project provides trainings on physical communications and cybersecurity, along with one-on-one support. These programs and others provide free and low-cost resources. And after this webinar, National Council of Nonprofits will be providing a listing of some other resources as well. Funders, you have the opportunity to ask your grantees what they need. Now more than ever, open communication is critical, and sometimes providing an anonymous option for communication works best. I would encourage you to provide flexible funding and capacity building opportunities. For nonprofits, the funder and grantee relationship does have two sides. Consider being as transparent as possible with your funders about your needs. Clear and trust-based communication will ensure timely support. Looking ahead and thinking about the future challenges and actions that we must take. The threats to civil society are escalating. Global patterns of restricting civil rights are being replicated in the US. For example, counterterrorism laws misused to limit activism, such as HR 9495, the rollback of DEI initiatives and redefinition of things like gender identity, and stricter immigration enforcement impacting vulnerable communities. These threats are real, evolving, and require urgent attention. My call to action. For funders, there are opportunities for us to learn from experiences in the global context. Solutions already exist. We also have an opportunity to look beyond our traditional focus and funding of singular issues and priorities. Consider the importance of defending civil society as a whole. Now more than ever, if you care about nonprofits, you care about civil society. An example of an opportunity for philanthropy together is the mobilization of funders through the Better Preparedness crisis response mechanism that the Human Rights Funders Network is organizing. For nonprofits, you are the experts in organizing. This is the moment to focus on your strengths and the organizing work that you know and do best. Stay connected with groups like NCN and state associations and advocacy group. Collective action is key. A strong civil society is truly not a luxury. It is a necessity. Now more than ever, we have the opportunity to come together. This moment really, truly calls for bold action. So let's rise to the challenge. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jean. Really appreciate your comments, your work, your partnership, and thank you for joining the call today. So next we have Jason Cohn. Jason founded the Robin Hood Foundation's Public Policy Department, and he leads it as Chief Public Policy Officer. Jason brings more than 20 years of experience guiding multidisciplinary teams through complex humanitarian crises, leading international and national social change advocacy campaigns, and managing critical security and risk incidents. Jason's been a tremendous support to NCN and to me personally, both in supporting our work and in being a thought partner to me and to our organization in meeting this moment. So Jason, I so appreciate your support and leadership, and I appreciate you joining this call. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. Appreciate being here and just grateful to be in such a wide and vast room with so many people who are working on the front lines to help people. Robin Hood is an organization, a foundation that its mission is really focused on fighting poverty in New York City. But we recognize that this moment, in fact, as has sort of been talked about by Skye and Damon earlier, is really unprecedented. It's a moment that funders have to really step up. They have to step up because there's a full frontal assault on the very communities that we serve and the leaders that work in the sector that serve those communities every day. We know at Robin Hood that that has required us to sort of rethink our approaches. It requires us to support and fund leaders like Diane and others who are fighting at every level in response to these critical threats. While our focus at Robin Hood is on helping to lift New Yorkers out of poverty and to find permanent pathways for economic opportunity and mobility, we know that one of the critical things that allows that to happen is the work of nonprofits, and is also the understanding that there will be a social safety net to help people. Right now, those two things are directly under threat. That is required for us to sort of rethink our approaches and to think, even as a place-based funder, to think about how we can operate at every level with our funding and to be responsive to the needs of the organizations that we fund. That means providing support to groups like the National Council of Nonprofits, but also their local counterparts like Nonprofit New York. It means thinking about funding organizations that work on the national level, looking at the social safety net programs like the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, but then funding local campaigns that are right now all across New York State trying to defend programs like Medicaid. It means that our management assistance arm, which is a part of Robin Hood that is really steeped in trying to support our grantees, is trying to think about different ways in which we can be responsive to their needs. That's everything from going out to the for-profit community and seeing what kinds of goodwill we can draw from them to give everything on expertise, from how to maintain the physical safety of your facilities to cybersecurity to how to manage risk, how to help support your board navigate through these crises. But ultimately, this is about, I think, for the funder community to really leave behind our restrictions on ourselves on what we can do. Every tool needs to be brought to bear in this moment. Too much is at stake. Too many of the organizations that we've invested in, many of us invested in for decades across the country and our communities, they are directly a threat. They face an uncertainty that is really incomprehensible for them in their day-to-day. So that requires us to really shake off any hesitancy that we may have. And we've unfortunately, while there's been a lot of great things that we've seen out there from funders, there's been a lot of quiet and timidness. Appreciate everything that Jean just went through. Those are, I think, the minimum that we need to be doing every day. But we need to be vocal. We need to stand both in front and behind our groups and the organizations that are making this work possible. It is everything from de-restricting our funding to supporting ways that we can give additional funding to thinking about ways that we can support efforts to both protect the sector and also the very vital programs that people in the communities we serve rely on every day, whether it's Medicaid, food stamps, housing vouchers, or the like. And so that's really, I think, the most essential thing that we can do as funders. We need to be there with the leaders who are taking the risk every day, who are putting their necks on the line, like Diane, like Skye, like Damon, like all the people that are working in their organizations and many others across the country. If we don't, we face really an existential threat to the communities that we serve, and it's a disservice. And now is the time to step up. It's time to step up when it's difficult, when it feels threatening, when the risk is high. That is when leadership matters. And we need that more and more from the funder sector, and to be creative and innovative, and really to rethink our own assumptions about what we can and should do as a funding community. So thank you so much for the time and space to talk, Diane. Look forward to answering any other questions later.
Thanks so much, Jason. I really appreciate your leadership and your partnership, and I appreciate your time today. Our final speaker today is my colleague at NCN, Tiffany Gourley Carter, NCN's Director of Public Policy and Policy Counsel. Tiffany, I'll turn to you.
Thanks, Diane. So we're going to pull up some slides, and we've been getting a lot of questions from you on what can I do? How can I get involved? And so we're going to give you very clear calls to action right now on contacting your member of Congress, but you're going to get these slides. So I want you to put your pen down, try not to take any notes, and just absorb what I'm about to say, because I want you to hear this and then know that you have the talking points and script after the fact that you can go back to get to pull together what you want to say. So just listen, but what we want you to do is contact your member of Congress. I want you to contact both your senator and your member of the House of Representatives. You can look it up on this link that we have, but you're going to contact both their DC office and their district office. The reason for this is that you want to build these relationships. And right now, the members of the House are home. They're in recess and they're in your district. So you want to reach out to both so that you can contact both and they can hear from you directly. When you call your DC office, they might ask you, who do you need to talk to? You want to say the staff, the tax staffer. Whenever you contact the district office, you're going to be asking for their district manager. We're going to give you the script in a second, but your big talking points, the only thing you need to remember is that you need to talk about the impact your organization is having on the ground, and you do this every day. It's not scary. It's really simple, and you already do this. So don't be worried. Don't be afraid. Just talk about your organization. Then, this is the other big takeaway. You're going to ask them to protect nonprofits doing irreplaceable work in their districts in the upcoming spending and tax debates, because right now they're having they're making these determinations on tax decisions, spending decisions, and they're taking everything that was just said on this webinar into account whenever they're trying to make decisions as from the legislature. And so they want to remember that they can't and shouldn't be harming nonprofits in those decision makings, because there's already all this impact coming out of the executive branch that is creating more strain on your services. And so they don't want to do that whenever they're making spending decisions when it comes to the spending and tax debates. So keep it under 5 minutes, keep it light, keep it friendly, and keep it helpful. Next slide. So what do you want to say? Number one, lead with impact. What your organization does every day. Talk about how you are professionals and volunteers in your district. You provide not just employment opportunities, but you're providing services to the constituents that these members of Congress serve every day. And then you want to give a couple examples. So stick to a couple of easy numbers that you already do. You serve 300 seniors 3 days a week. You provide 500 kids after school opportunities. You put on 3 theater performances a year. Whatever it is, it doesn't need to be a huge number. It just needs to be an impactful number. And then once again, be friendly, be helpful, invite them to your operations, bring them to your facility, bring them to your office, show them what you're doing every day. This is really helpful for them to really hone in on the impact that you are having and remember what you do. And insider tip, district managers don't know what to do with members of Congress whenever they're home, and they need to find something for them to do. And this is a good opportunity for you to build those relationships. Then, once again, I said 5 minutes, remember, ask them to support your organization, support nonprofits in the spending debates that impact you and their constituents every day. So that's it, really simple. Next slide. What we want to get to is you being comfortable with sharing your story. You might get a little bit of pushback. Maybe you don't have the best relationship with this office, or maybe you've tried to build these relationships before. Here's some pushback. Here's some things that you can say in response. But the big thing is, you provide a service to a problem in their district that if you went away, those problems will still exist, and that's going to put more strain onto state and local governments to fill that void. And so that's what you can come back with. It doesn't really matter where, who they're asking about whenever you're talking about real people and the services that you're providing. So you end with thanking them, invite them to your organization, ask for their contact information, promise not to spam them, right? Stay helpful and friendly, but be a resource going forward. Next slide. These are some framing considerations. If you maybe get tongue-tied or don't really know what to say, you can fall back on these. Nonprofits form the cornerstone of civil society. That's what Jason was just saying, right? Nonprofits do what governments can't or won't do. We're woven into the fabric of our communities. And if you went away, if your services went away, those problems will still remain and in many cases get worse. So that's why you are so important in your communities. So next slide, keep this in mind. But know that one phone call from you can make a huge difference. Phone calls are the #1 most impactful way to advocate to members on the Hill. They're more powerful than letters. And so you can do this and it will only take 5 minutes. But remember, no one knows your organization better than you do. And these are people who are trying to solve problems, and you are the problem solvers in your communities. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jessica, to do some question and answers.
Thanks, Tiffany. And so before we officially begin the Q&A, I do want to note that we did receive more than 5,000 registrations for the live event and 6,000 to receive the recording. So we have well over 1,000 questions that were submitted. So while these questions will not be specific to a program or agency, we hope that the answers provided are as helpful to as many people who attended or are tuning in as possible. So the first question, I will tee it up for, let's see, Damon. And I also invite everyone to join, turn on the camera if they can. And so, Damon, do you have any advice or tools that boards can use to think through the risks that these diversity, equity, and inclusion executive orders could have on their organizations?
Sure, great question. We're working out some open source tools, but those tools will be born out of our experience in advisory work. I want to thank friends like Jean at the Packard Foundation and others who've invested in an effort that we've been calling our Protecting and Advancing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative. For about the last year and a quarter, maybe even a year and a half, we have taken referrals from our friends at Philanthropy who have grantees who have questions, even before these executive orders on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or these planned funding freezes. And we've had, to this point, over 100 intakes of smaller nonprofits, pipeline programs, scholarship programs. For example, an organization whose mission is to get more Black girls into medical professions. They have a race-targeted, race-conscious mission and operation, and they want to make sure they can still do their work and still make an impact. And so from those 100 intakes, there have been a number of active advisories, no litigation to date. But we know that sometimes that feels inevitable. And we support these organizations every step of the way through attorney-client privilege communications. You can reach out to me directly. I'm sure we'll share the information, or go to our website at lawyerscommittee.org to find out more information about that initiative. I also want to announce a tool that we do have, really just a fact page, a 2-pager for our friends in philanthropy that may also be useful to nonprofit grantees. I'm not sure if I can share it here in chat form, but we can circulate it. But it's a tool, it's a resource that is really designed to address the landscape of investing in racial equity through charitable grants and services. It debunks a lot of the myths that people have about the Fearless Fund case, and addresses some of the potential gray areas about whether your grant is in fact a donative transfer or a contract, what law applies. For example, for the lawyers out there, there's a question about 42 USC section 1981, the nation's really oldest civil rights law that addresses discrimination in private contracting. And so trust-based philanthropy, general support grants are not necessarily ways to skirt all of that and get around it, but ways to help insulate your grants and your grantees for philanthropy and nonprofits from attack.
Thanks, Damon. And the next question, I think, could go to either Jason or Jean, whoever feels more comfortable answering first. So in what ways can philanthropy help organizations manage some of the legal challenges, sustain the core work, and ensure team wellness?
You want me to go first, Gene? Okay. Well, I think, a lot of this starts with really just making sure we're listening to our grantees to understand exactly first and foremost what are the most sort of acute needs that they have. And what we've tried to do at Robinhood is ask questions, but be responsive with programming and support. And that has, been as a foundation being able to sort of connect with experts in various areas, as I was saying earlier, whether it's on cybersecurity, physical security, looking at legal risk. So how are you connected to your community wherever you are situated as a funder? Because I think there is a lot of untapped desire from various institutions or bar associations to really sort of jump in and sort of be helpful, but we need to sort of match the need with the expertise. And I think that's very much oftentimes the role of funders as conveners to sort of bring those parties together. Really important. And also just thinking and reflecting about our grant making practices, I think, as Gene was saying earlier as well. Can we de-restrict our grants, project-based grants? Can we be more flexible, responsive, right? Can we also just make things easier on reporting side? A lot of that was done, I think, during COVID as well, during the COVID response. It's very different types of threats manifesting, but it is still having a similar pressure. So how can we really sort of find that sweet spot between accountability and oversight as a funder, but also recognizing the realities that our grantees and our communities are facing right in this moment?
I don't have much to add, plus one to everything Jason said, and I did try to speak to some of this, Jessica, in my comments. I think my only addition would be, as I said, the importance of that open, clear communication. And as Jason also said, the role that funders can play in being responsive and actually providing some opportunities and solutions. I'll also just say that, from our perspective, whether you call it capacity building or management assistance or organizational strengthening, support around things like wellness and security, from my perspective, is all under that umbrella. So funders, listen to your grantees and what they need, and provide them with options for these types of supports.
Thank you both. And we have time for literally just one last question, but I think all of us can either chime in through resources or reflections, which is the tips for nonprofits to talk to current and new potential funders to fill in the gaps that have been created by the funding cuts.
And
I'll-
just
Sorry, Jason. I guess this is a hard one, and one observation I'll make is that the reality is that there is not enough funding in the private and family foundation universe to make up for the federal funding cuts, and that is the reality. And so again, not to sound like a broken record, but I think just having the open conversation between the nonprofits and the funder community is most critical. And I think it's honing in on, as I mentioned earlier, what can nonprofits do? Things like organizing, things like collaborating, and what can funders do similarly, coming together, working more collaboratively and in a unified way to address what's happening.
I would just add, from the perspective of a grantee of both large and individual philanthropy, we are facing this protracted period of what feels like loss from the heights of 2020, which carried over into 2021 and 2022 for certain multi-year grants, to now the prospect of, even those of us who aren't losing federal funding, because many of us, like at Lawyers Committee, we don't take federal grants, what have you, but the environment has a real chill, kind of a frost to it right now. And on top of that, many of us are having to invest more in institutional resilience. And so I think the institutional resilience, I think, to some of the programs that Gene talked about for Packard grantees, that's one of the early conversations to have. So it will be a shame to have a sense that there's less funding available generally, not just from big philanthropy, but generally plus having to spend more money out of pocket just to keep your operations and your people safe and healthy. That's why I think philanthropy could really step in.
Just to add really quickly, I think like time is now. Funders need to step up. They need to ask themselves why are they not stepping up in the way they did a few years ago, when it was sort of frankly might have been a little easier to step up. And we need to really look ourselves in the mirror in that response and just think about what we need to do right now, because the stakes are incredibly high. As Jean said, we can't make up for a complete retrenchment of the social contract between government and communities. We just can't make up for that. And so, but there are people on the front lines fighting that fight, whether it's in the courts, whether it's showing up in town halls, whether it's making those phone calls Tiffany was just talking about. But we can't do that without the resources and the support that these organizations have been going on and on for emergency after too many years right now. And we need to step up for them.
Thanks, everyone. Once again, thank you, Damon, Jean, Tiffany, and Jason. And I'll pass it back to Diane for wrapping up.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. And thank you to all of our incredible speakers today for your work and your partnership and your leadership. So appreciate you joining us today. Thanks for the thousands of participants that have joined for today's webinar. I want to remind everybody that at the National Council of Nonprofits, our closest, our most essential partners in this work is our network of state associations of nonprofits. We have 54 state and regional associations throughout the country. If you're not a member of your state association, I really encourage you to join, especially now. In doing so, you'll also become a member of the National Council of Nonprofits. And together, that's going to be the best way for you to stay up to date on the broad array of threats and challenges and actions you can take to defend the full nonprofit sector. We're going to continue to share information on actions impacting nonprofits and ways that you can get involved, including a communication guide that you all can use, which will include some of those talking points that Tiffany shared to really make a robust and compelling case for the nonprofit sector. We're also going to be going through all 1,000 of those questions that came through, and we'll be updating regularly our answers to FAQs, posting those online. So check back at, to that document regularly, and much more information and resources to come. Above all, we will continue fighting to defend and advance the essential work of the nonprofit sector. And we invite you to join us in continuing to meet this moment together. Take care. Thank you, and see you next time.